You know, there have always been conversations around food. And food, as it turns out, is a big part of the Corinthian conversation. And it's part of our conversation today. So let's see if we can pause for just the next few minutes and see what the apostle is cooking. This is part 4 of our series, and I want to begin by doing something a little different. Taking my Bible and reading the entire chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, I'll give you a second to turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. I want to set the stage because I have so much to say today. I don't want to miss out on the scriptures. And I want you to begin to think along these lines. Paul deals with this in a few chapters here in the middle of the book. And so this is not an isolated incident. This is a whole section of issues that Paul is dealing with. So he's just transitioned off what we talked about last week, and now he says, now about food, verse 1, sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge. And then he says, but knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So that's the premise of everything that he's going to say. You know, it's one thing to know and to understand certain things, but if the motivating factor beneath it all isn't love, you know, he gets to that later in the book, then you're headed down the wrong path. Knowledge brings about pride in a person's life. Verse 2 says, the man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. So as soon as you think that you know something, you should have a clue that you really don't know anything at all. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. But the man who loves God is known by God, and that's ideal. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols. So now he gets back. He's like a preacher, right? Starts something, goes off on something else, then gets back to it. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. Now, in other places, he'll say, we know the power behind that is demonic. Okay, so I don't want to diminish that. I won't mention that today. That's another sermon. But I'm aware of that, so it doesn't stick in your mind and you worry about that and don't hear what I have to say today. What God, I feel like, wants me to say today. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, indeed there are many gods and many lords, speaking about all the idols around town. Yet for us, for Christians, there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, although whom all things came and through whom all things came and through whom we live. But not everyone knows this. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. You see, Paul is so practical. You know, we like to spiritualize everything. Spiritually proud people, people who have knowledge, get puffed up. And they start reading between the lines. And Paul's saying, look, you're sweating the wrong stuff here, guys. Verse 9 says, be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. And we're familiar with that. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you who have this knowledge eating in an idol's temple, which apparently they were doing, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. Just because you can doesn't mean it's good for anyone else. when you sin against your brothers in this way and wound their weak conscience, I won't mention this, so pay attention. You sin against Christ. When you hurt somebody else, you sin against not just them, but against Christ, and really the whole body of Christ. So this is big stuff. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. That's the bottom line for Paul. And that is 1 Corinthians. I need to get a stand here for my Bible. That is 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Now he talks some more about it, and we will too over in chapter 10 today. A few years ago in a large church in the Dallas area, some high school students in a class were asked some questions. One of the key questions in that class, that this class was built around actually, one of the key questions was, among your peers, who is regarded as your hero? Because you know, if you know who somebody's hero is, you know a lot about that person. So the classroom started buzzing with discussion right away, and out of the toaster, there's your picture of the toaster in the bulletin, out of the toaster of all that popped names that weren't too unpredictable among high school students. Remember, this a few years ago. Brad Pitt, Tony Stark, I had to look up who that is. That's Iron Man, right? Jesus, but the leaders of that class ruled Jesus out because he was too obvious for that class. And all these other people were named who were basically then from the celebrity industry that constitutes most of the pop culture that we live in today. And among the long list of people, the one name that ended up percolating up out of all of that as their most heroic person in the mind of these students, and you're never going to guess who this was. I'm not even going to ask you. But I will tell you this, if I were to update it, it's not a delusional junior politician or a teen social media influencer, whatever they are. This was a few years ago, and so their top name was Jessica Simpson. I mean, that's how weird do you get, right? Not her, but why would they come up with this? You have to think of you have to think yourself like, why would they say that? And you'll be amazed, and it's not too far off from maybe the way we think. I mean, she hasn't found a cure for cancer. She hasn't found a way for us as a people to overcome racism. She hasn't stopped human trafficking in its tracks. As it turns out, the reasoning behind all of this was that Jessica Simpson is her hero because she, in their minds, lives the optimal life. And here's what the optimal life is. No trade-offs. A life with no trade-offs. A life in which there is never a hard choice. A life in which I get to be a pop star, a Sunday school teacher, which she was at the time, a reality show star, I'm married to another pop star, and I get my own line of cosmetics and perfumes, I have kids, and I get to raise them myself, and all of this happens for me, and in the midst of all of this, these high school students are thinking Jessica Simpson has it all, a life with no trade-offs. I have to sacrifice nothing. We want to let these people vote. What are we talking about? A life where what's guaranteed is, and we all fall prey to this, a kind of godlike state above sacrifice that other people down there have to make. The logic of it is this. As with the Ben Affleck movie, Changing Lanes, which I never saw but I did read up on, if I just rise to a certain level, I will reach an altitude where sacrifice and trade-off no longer occurs. But what his character finds out in this movie is that the opposite is actually true. The higher you rise, the harder the trade-offs get. The higher you rise, the bigger the sacrifice becomes. Because the more chips you put out on the table, the harder it is to bet. There's more at risk. And he discovers this hard truth. If I'm going to live at this level, which he tries to achieve, he's asked by his wife, can you stay here on the edge with me? Can you handle that? Do you understand that what you are is a professional thief. He's actually an attorney, which I think this is pretty much true life, right? Hope there's no attorneys around. Might get sued. Do you understand that you are a professional thief in an expensive suit? You're dressed in Armani, but you are a gangster inside. Are you able to handle that trade-off? He's trying to climb up the ladder. And the trade-off is this. What she's saying is this. The trade-off is to surrender your values, your morals, your ethics in order to have the house, the car, the life. And in essence, she's saying, to have me, I go with that package too. To have a life with no trade-offs. What are you willing to surrender to get to that place? And can you stay there once you get there? The truth is, there's always going to be trade-offs in life, as his character finds out. And being able to manage the trade-offs is a part of what we're calling, for our series, Christian Normal. That's the name of the series for this month, and we're taking it. Our laboratory is the book of 1 Corinthians, as I've already read from, and our series of teachings has been about not just trying to endure culture, not just trying to fight against it and protect ourselves, but in the midst of all that, how can we actually be contributors to it without letting it eat us alive? Because the culture around us, the truth is, and I've used different metaphors for this, it is like a big barking dog. It's a carnivore, and it is always hungry. And if it has to, it will just take one little bite of us out at a time until it eats us whole and alive. So, if we can be positive contributors then for Jesus in the middle of all of this, that puts us in a whole different relationship with the world that we live in. That puts us in what we would call Christian normal. If we can not just endure this, but with Christ's help, do what his word instructs, then we can actually give back to the culture. We don't have to worry about fighting it off all the time because we're too busy pouring our lives into it for the good. Now, the Apostle Paul arrived in the Greek city of Corinth. It was a city of about 100,000. There were some Jews in the city, and there were some Gentiles, some pagans, some idolaters. The scripture calls them Greeks here. And it's the middle of the first century, and he comes in and he plants this new faith community, and it goes really well. It's this thriving little tender shoot. Just sort of takes off out of this Greek soil, which is now a Roman colony, the city. It's a startup city. It's not very old. It's like a startup of a company, except that Julius Caesar uses all of those same dynamics to start this city. And they're planted right in the middle of all of this. And everything goes so well that Paul feels that after a while, hey, I can go on and get on with ministry. And so he leaves after a while, but not too long after he's gone. I've said this every week now. He starts getting messages in writing and in person from people in Corinth saying, we have all of these problems and you've got to help us. They were trying to fend off culture, but they didn't know how. And you have to ask yourself, what happened? The Apostle Paul was with them for 18 months. How could so much go wrong in such a short period of time? Just maybe 2 or 3 years. I mean, why would he not give them all of these teachings about all of these different things while he was with them for 18 months? And one of the reasons that scholars give that seem to make sense is probably that some new problems arose because of a change in the city. Again, we talked about that last week. Some things changed in Corinth after he left. And one of the things that changed was not just the famine that we talked about last week, but to continue that, and you would never pick this up by reading the book. What changed about all that was their relationship, the Corinthians' relationship with food. It's a shock, but if you would add it up, a massive part of this letter is devoted to the idea of food. Now, when we studied the book of Acts, I hit time and time again on this idea of food and fellowship between Jews and Christians and how much struggle they had over all of that. And you probably looked at me cross-eyed. But this was a major bone of contention in the ancient world, where Gentiles outside of the Jewish faith and custom of eating kosher foods were now coming into the church. What in the world do we do with all of this? How do we navigate all this? Because this is foreign to both parties. Can we even fellowship together? I mean, Peter has to have, visions about it. And he's still hardcore. He's arguing with the Lord about it. So it's a big deal. So would you agree with me? In light of all that, would you agree with me that food is pretty important? Especially in the culture of a people, right? You go somewhere else, they eat different kinds of food. You may like it, you may not. But food has the opportunity to not only draw people around it, but also to give it some identity. Just about everything that you need to know about a town, you can find by touring their restaurants. And let me just throw out a little test for you here. Some of the cities, I'm just proving my point here, some of the cities are even known for famous foods around the country. If I would say to you, Boston, what would you say? That is true, but I chose baked beans. What if I said Kansas City? Barbecue. You are my man, Spence. Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm doing this, and what do I do on Friday night? I say, Pam, we got to go get barbecue. We ended up eating chicken. It was too late on Friday evening. I started thinking about barbecue. I'm looking at pictures. I'm thinking, I want some barbecue. What if I said Philadelphia? Philly. Cheesesteak. What if I said New Orleans? Gumbo. Now, I asked Roy about this because he's from Louisiana, Dave. I got a whole lecture on crawfish. And that was all cool. And I also was able to give Roy a new nickname, Mr. Roy Jangles. He danced a lick. What if I said Buffalo? Hot wings. What if I said Chicago? Deep dish pizza. And it's made it here, and you can't even get in the place, I understand. But that's okay because I'm from Dayton. And if Dayton might be known for anything, I mean, Cincinnati may be known for chili, but maybe Dayton is known for thin crust, Marion's or Casanos, which, by the way, they started out together. That might be, that's almost famous. Have you heard of Primanti Brothers? It's actually new in town. And they say that their sandwiches are almost famous. A church planter at the time, so this is a few years ago, in a prestigious liberal college town on the left coast, says this. I had a wonderful experience last week. I was in the city of Pittsburgh for a church planting conference, and what I loved about this was that this is not just a location of the conference, it is also my hometown. This is where this guy's from. And so my family took me out for a Pittsburgh-style dinner, and they took me to a place called Primanti Brothers, which is a local franchise. As I said, now they have one here. I checked it out. And they're famous there for one thing, massive monster sandwiches that he describes as, it's like this thing. It's a big, huge pile of meat. And what the signature trait, other than the massive slabs of French bread on top and bottom, just soft, chewy, and doughy, is that they take the French fries and they put them inside. They take your coleslaw and they put that inside, and you crunch the whole thing down, and you take it with both hands, and you eat it like a man. It looks like this. And then he goes on to say, I mean, it is a massively massive sandwich. And it's a Pittsburgh tradition. This sandwich says one thing to me, he says, home. And it's indigenous. It's native in the ways that I can't begin to understand. The sandwich is, it's distinctively blue collar, a state of living which is something that people who aren't there think of, and when they do, they think you need to rise above that. People look at this with disdain, and that you have to get above it. This is unapologetically blue collar. It is brazenly filled with a number of calories that a Pittsburgh steel worker would need to work an entire shift in a sweaty, steamy, fume-filled steel mill. It's a sandwich that flies in the face of every fad diet and health-conscious food guru. And although it's been on the Food Network, it swims upstream against all of that. And it says that Pittsburghers understand. It says that you work hard in life, you make no excuses, and since we all have to die anyway, you might as well have a good sandwich on the way out, baby. That's Pittsburgh. That defines, for him, that defines the town, and it defies everything that's healthy and good for you. And yet it defines who he is. So he says, this is our point of view, speaking as a Pittsburgher. I got that from him, so that must be what they are. You might tell me, that's so wrong, that's heathen, so blue collar, that's so low, that's so down there. That's not where I live up here in the stratosphere above all of the trade-offs. I'm back to trade-offs. But it's who I am, he says. It's all I know in my heart of hearts. It's everything I know. And then he finishes that out by saying, it is a revolution in a bun. I say all that to say this. Food is an adhesive that holds groups together. If you will, it's an ID card. And it defines them. It gives them identity. And that's what's happened in Corinth for so long now. Now, two things changed, though, after Paul leaves in Corinth, and they had to do with food in the city. One was private, and the other had to do with food in public. So here's the private change that took place. This is the changing lanes. You get my title, the illustration. Changing lanes. In the movie, it's what caused the collision, and the same thing is true here. There's going to be a collision because some things changed as far as our ability to be able to purchase meat in the market, and what do we do when we eat it in private. The Roman government had extended to the Jews in the region the right to have kosher meat in the meat markets. Now, this was not an act of kindness, and it did two things. It pacified the Jewish population by removing an irritant that would eventually rise up and cause trouble within the city. And second, it gave the Romans something to retract if that were ever an option, that they would have to do that. And in doing so, then they could hold that over the Jews' heads, and they could keep order in the city if necessary. And if they keep order, then their jobs are also safe. Did you ever wonder why, because this is the principle, did you ever wonder why Romans ruled the entire Mediterranean basin with just a few governors in a system? That's why they could do it. You hand things out, and if the people act up, you take them back. Now, how contemporary is this? Just think about that for a second. How appealing might that be? A governor and a small entourage could dominate an entire region simply by extending a few privileges to them. And if the people of the region disobeyed, what would they do? They retract them. They retract the privileges, and everyone knows how that game is played. And so, in Corinth, they had order while Paul was there. Most Jews around the empire and in Corinth, they were happy. The Christians were happy. Everybody was happy, 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 as Phil would say. And then the city of Rome expelled the Jews. It's recorded in Acts 18:2. That chapter also tells the story of Paul in the city of Corinth. And Corinth probably then followed suit, scholars say, looking for a way to crack down on the Jewish population to prove their loyalty to the empire. They're a Roman colony. It's all about loyalty. Another thing that I could throw in here, but I don't want to go into it, is the fact that the imperial cult moved in when Paul moved out. There was always emperor worship, but now it became an official thing in the city. And so there was increased pressure on the Roman leaders in that city to demonstrate even more loyalty to Rome. Because now you don't just worship at temples around the city, you also have to give yourself over to emperor worship on a whole new level to prove your loyalty and to keep Rome from knocking on your door and scorching the earth that you stand on. In these colonies, in these cities, you had to prove that you were loyal to the emperor and the empire. And the only thing they really had control over was the diet issue at this point, because all of the other Roman laws were written to protect the Jews. They were considered a sect of people within the empire that had rights within the Roman legal system. So the only thing that the leaders had was this whole meat issue, this whole food issue. So they extend it, knowing that if they pull that back, that's going to cause some real problems. And so what they do is they kick the Jews out of town, and probably to strengthen that, they go ahead and they get rid of kosher food from the meat markets. Now, all of the meat, all of the protein that you can find in town is basically sold in one place, and that is at these official meat markets. And almost all of it, here's a big problem, almost all of it is offered to idols. You take a portion of it, you offer to the idol, you give another portion to the workers in that temple, and then you sell the rest of it in the market. So now, this is a radical change for these new Christians. They're thrown for a loop by this because the Romans made this decision. And what the Christians are actually doing in town is, please catch this pun, they're piggybacking, get it, Lance? They're piggybacking on top of Jewish culture. They don't want anything to do with what's been offered to idols. Even if they're from a Gentile, pagan background. They've sworn all that away as best they can, and this makes it easy. Maybe they haven't dealt with it fully in their hearts, but it makes it easy. They can just go to the market and they can buy kosher meat and everything is good. That's Jewish normal. And that's Christian normal. And so when they go to the meat market, they're buying kosher meat, and this gets them around the problem. Can I eat something that has been offered to a pagan idol? No worries. You don't have to worry about it. But when things change, So when the kosher meat is taken out of the way, the Christians are in a jam, and that brings them to Paul with this question, look, what should we do now? Everything was going so well. Everybody was happy, but now this has happened. So in chapter 8 that I read earlier, that's what Paul is addressing. They have asked him about things that have been offered to idols, meat that's been offered to idols. Can we eat these things sacrificed to idols? And so Paul instructs them, as I read, in this way. Basically, he says, if you go to the meat market, just buy the stuff that you need if you feel comfortable, right? If you don't compromise your own conscience, just go and buy it. There is no trade, as long as there's no trade-off as a matter of your own conscience, no sacrifice, no compromise, it's okay. It's a don't ask, don't tell situation. You don't have to inquire, hey, has this food been offered, has this meat been offered to an idol? Just buy what's there, and when you get home, in private, eat it. What's the big deal? You see how that could divide believers and how they feel about things? And his reasoning is that idols of these products that have been offered to those idols aren't anything but carved wood and stone anyway. You know there is no God but one. Just go and buy it and take it home and eat it. So what's the big deal, right? And that's so practical, and it's not what you would expect. You expect him to say just the opposite. No. You must not eat anything offered to idols because it will bring on contamination, but he doesn't say that. But he echoes Jesus' words, though. He says this in a different way. Jesus would say it this way, it's what comes out of your mouth that defiles you, it's not what goes in. And so he tells them, on a private level, where there are no consequences for anybody else, just go to the market and shop as you normally would. Don't make any special effort to buy. Don't make any special effort not to buy. And that's acceptable. And if you're invited to a private dinner party, he writes to them, you don't have to ask where the meat comes from. Don't ask. Now you're in a public setting, though, and some things do change. But if they tell you that it's been offered to idols, then you better hold off. Don't ask, but if they tell you, you got to consider holding off. And his reasoning is simple. You don't know who's watching. Someone who has a conscience that could really be wounded, that might see you eat a piece of meat and think, oh, man. And a couple things could happen. They could become so discouraged when they saw you involved in that behavior that it could wilt them spiritually. And the other is, they could be tempted to engage in it themselves, which although it is not a sin per se, it becomes an offense to them because they think what they're doing is wrong. And they're yielding to temptation that would not have been in their life if, let me put this in personal terms, if I had not done that. You see, if you know, and it's public, you got to hold off for the sake of someone else, because you don't know who's watching. And so his argument is this: for the sake of the conscience of the person who might be wounded by your behavior, the person who has no issues with eating that meat, if you voluntarily refrain from eating it, there's no harm to you, and there's no benefit to you. But all of the benefit is for the one who is the potential objector. And that's the trade-off. That's Christian normal in Paul's view. That's the biblical view. Now, we don't have that much problem with food. Like us, they needed to wash that food down with something. And that something was drink. So I just want to touch on that for a second. Their dinners all had drinking in this context. As a matter of fact, Paul has to deal with it in chapter 11, where the Corinthians are coming to church for their communion services, their love feasts as they're called, and the elite up here, those that live in the stratosphere above trade-offs, came and they ate early before all the poor working people could get there, depriving them of a meal. It's all for their benefit, you see. It's all for their advantage. And then, after that, they're getting drunk on the wine. That's Corinthian normal. Now, I don't drink. Not at all. And there are several reasons for that. But I'll save that for another sermon. Some of you might think it's admissible for you, and you're free to partake. You may think that. And I'm not going to address that today either. But what I will say is this: for the sake of someone who might be harmed by such freedom, make the trade-off. Just abstain for the sake of the person who might be harmed. Now, once a month on Monday night, we have a board meeting. And on Monday nights, every Monday night here at the church, this group meets. Now, what if we thought that it was all right? They meet back there. What if we thought, as a board, it's okay to drink? And one of them came in and they saw us. You know, they're looking for a safe place away from all of the pressure to do that again. And we're saying to them, it's okay. Why don't we just abstain? Why don't we just make the trade-off? I can make arguments on every side on this, but I'm not going to do that today because I'm talking about food and not drink. But the principle is still there. So as I read this passage, you know, you think it really makes sense. You know that there are just some places where I have to make this kind of a choice. Even though it may be more fun, it may be more interesting, it may go better with my food, which is my usual, that's water, right? And I know, listen, it may be okay. It may taste better with my food. I know a preacher I got an argument with because he liked to drink near beer with pizza. Speaking of pizza, I said, what do you want to do that in public for? That's ridiculous. And he is my senior by a long shot. But the truth is, I know people who died for Jesus. Some of them are already believers, and some of them are not believers. Jesus died for them both equally. But if I involve myself in certain behaviors, I'm using this as an example, if I were to be involved in that behavior myself, if that would change their opinion of what I represent or lure them into participating something that might be safe for me, but might not be safe for them, then the hard trade-off is I err on the side of their interest and I don't express my freedom. So what's Paul saying? The issue here is not eating or drinking. The issue here is the trade-off. That there is no level of accomplishments where the trade-offs stop existing. No matter how spiritual you might think yourself to be, those trade-offs might just be getting bigger. You with knowledge. They might just be getting bigger and tougher. But if I'm going to be living a life of Christian normal, the object of that life is not my own advantage. The object of that life is your advantage. It's what's best for you. And so maybe we need to manage those trade-offs sometimes a little better than what we do. Because you know this argument is much larger than food too. It's a lot of other little things in our life. And these things sound so countercultural, so Americanitas. My drive to excel, my drive to win, my drive to advance, even my personal freedoms, they cannot be challenged. It's an affront to me. Don't you know who I am and where I live and what my freedoms are? And when that whole system is throwing gasoline then on the fire of my personal ambition every single day, it's okay to advance and to excel and all of that. But I can't let that consume me. That can't drive my choices. It's okay to excel. It's okay to experience and work hard and do what's necessary for advancement. That's okay as long as you understand, and I understand, that there are going to be trade-offs that never go away. And what my faith ultimately turns out to be is how I live those trade-outs out in front of other people. Because they're going to be hard choices. And they're only going to get harder as I grow and develop until they're not harder anymore. Until it's just my way of life. But then there's always something lurking in the background that I'm not quite willing to give up yet for the sake of somebody else, even though I know it may be hurting them, potentially. And I never know who's watching. In a world where it's Corinthian normal all the time, and you are living Christian normal, the tension will always be there. So, you know who the real heroes are. It's not Tony Stark, not Iron Man. The real heroes are the people who acquire significant influence in the world, but hold on to their soul. They don't give their soul away in pursuit of the kind of influence that's possible. And just as important as that is, also my heroes might just be the people who do their best, maybe live a life of what seems to be little influence, but they keep their soul intact no matter what by trading off their good for that of others. High or low. Influence, little influence. That's Christian normal. That's what Paul is talking about here. It's changing lanes in a way that doesn't get me ahead. And believe me, I like to do that. It's changing lanes in a way that doesn't get me ahead, but it allows you to go first. It's just not for me. That's for you too. That goes for you. It goes for us. That's where we put all of our chips. We change lanes only when it's advantageous for someone else. You know, it's wonderful to find eternal life in Christ. Eternal life, that's the only place where it's available. He comes into your heart, He changes everything. He washes you, He does your laundry, man. And He puts it somewhere. He puts your past somewhere that you'll never see it again. And He never thinks about it either. To Him, it's like it never happened. And then this new life becomes a vehicle, a platform, where all of those gifts that God put in you before you were ever born can come pouring out in a way that changes everything. Not just for you, but for everyone around you. Jesus lays down his life for you, so you lay yours down. You trade off those gifts, not so that you can be elevated, but so that you can elevate everyone around you. That's Christian normal. But what happens when you're trying to live Christian normal, when you're trying to manage the trade-offs, and when they begin to happen, you know what's waiting at the door for you? The religion of me. Like temples all around the town. My ambition, my goals, my time, my life. You're busy with all of that, working your way up for you and for your family. And the problem is, your faith is going to come up one day, and bam, that trade-off moment is going to happen. And this is what's happening in Corinth, and this is why they're writing Paul with these questions. Like they're trying to live Christian normal, and their faith is now coming up because of what they might be or might not be participating in. And like them, you'll be in a place where it's a social function, and there'll be people around. And you're going to have to make a decision. There's going to be a decision about some kind of behavior that you're going to have to make. It may be okay for you. It won't hurt you, it won't harm you, but it could totally destroy what Paul would call a weaker brother or sister. To say, no big deal, I have the right of way. It's like Ben Affleck's wife saying, you need to change lanes. Right? It's asking ourselves, can we live right there with her on the edge where we've traded everything else off just to get the position? And so Paul, in writing back to the Corinthians, simply says, Christian normal kind of goes the other way. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, this is how it reads. I'm going to start at verse 23. He starts out by quoting in this verse one of their slogans. This is some of the knowledge that they have, right? I have the right to do anything, they would say. Older translations say, and you'll be familiar with this, all things are lawful for me. That's what they're saying. Look, I can do anything. They're puffed up with knowledge. You say, you see, I have the right to do anything, you say. And then Paul adds this, but not everything is beneficial. And then he comes back with that same slogan, I have the right to do anything, and then he adds this, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. For example, verse 25, eat anything sold in the meat market without raising question of conscience. We've been talking about that. If it doesn't bother you to do it, you don't have to go up to the butcher and ask, hey, was this offered to Poseidon? And here's the reason, verse 26. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. This is from Proverbs 24. And this is the blessing that every Jew said over every meal. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So, verse 27, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, you don't have to go. But if you do go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. I mean, don't sweat it. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, it goes public here, then don't eat it. In other words, if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat it because that breaks cover. And you go public. And there are consequences for other people when it goes public. This is why you don't do it. Both for the sake of the one who told you, because now that person knows that you know, and for the sake of conscience. That is for the sake of the unbelieving person who invited you and who's now told you, and for the sake of the conscience of what Paul might call a weaker brother or sister who might be observing you at the same dinner. For everyone involved, when it goes public, abstain. Even if it's okay for you, don't sweat it. Just don't eat because you know. And everybody else knows that you know. In other words, the person who is outside of the Christian faith is just as likely to be damaged by a wrong choice that may not be wrong per se, but is wrong in this context because that person might be believing that you're going to be living different. I'm going to be living in a different way. And then they begin to think, hey, I live just like they live all of a sudden. To them, they may be thinking it inaccurately, but they think it nonetheless, hey, they're no different than I am. Those Christians, what's the big deal? Do you see the weight of this? All centered around food. Something simple like that. And my weaker friend, in that context, doesn't perhaps have the conscience yet. It hasn't grown to the point where they're okay with this. Like maybe they're still a baby Christian and they're traumatized by the fact that you would do something like that, and they haven't been able to grow enough to actually see that idols are nothing. And you can exercise your freedom, but in doing so, you're hurting me. You're crushing me. Because they see now me involved in whatever it is, which may not be wrong per se, but in the context, they're obliterated by it, by the shock of watching someone, perhaps someone he or she respected, taking what appears to be to them a step back, which is no step at all in reality, but in the context of the situation, it is. Are you following my argument today? It's really pretty simple. I'm saying it in a million different ways. For the sake of someone else, don't become a stumbling block. Before I read on, I just want to give you one quick illustration. When I was in college, I had a professor, and I won't name him. He was also my Sunday school teacher. Pam and I were in his Sunday school class for about a year while we were there. He's a big man on campus. He had the name. They probably will name some, they would name some hall after him when he's gone on that campus, if it were possible. And we got in. He was teaching Romans and Galatians at the time. That was the class I was in. But he actually worked on the translation for 1st and 2nd Corinthians in the New Living Translation, which I almost used for this whole series because he translated it. But in that class, the distinction that wasn't made, there was a huge fight. And it's one of the only times I spoke up in college. I was there. I was paying money. I wanted to hear what the professor said, not what the students thought. That's what I'm paying for, okay? I'm not here to hear some harebrained idea that you got somewhere in youth group. Like, I'm paying for this. I want to know what the big dogs think. And there was an argument between the teacher and one of the students, a girl. And this guy was very intimidating. And he was arguing that it was his right to have something that looked like a drink out in public if he wanted to. I suppose he was thinking out in public, and she could not get over the fact that he would do something like that that could possibly cause someone to stumble. And maybe what he was arguing, I'm hoping that what he was arguing is that in private, you know, if you like to put ice in a drink with red coloring and a little umbrella on top of it and you drink it for the taste, okay, knock yourself out. But when it comes to being in public, for the sake of somebody else. And I spoke up and I defended this young lady, but it was because this distinction wasn't made. Okay? What you do in private, that's up to you, but that'll be a sermon for another day. We'll talk about that too. So I struggled with this for a long time. Like, where's the balance and all that? Because I saw that interaction. I knew what I felt. I knew what I thought. But when I realized this is public and private, then some things changed a little bit for me. And so what he says in verse 29, I'm referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. You do this for the other person. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? That's what the professor was saying. For if I partake in a meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something that I thank God for? That Proverbs 24 blessing. So when I'm on my own, I don't have to be reined in by somebody else's conscience. Like, I don't have to live by somebody else's rules and regulations. Just because it's wrong for you doesn't mean it's wrong for me. Just because it's right for you doesn't mean it's right for me. Because God also gives us a conscience. We can't violate that conscience. That's a sin when we do that. So whether we eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. See, it's not about you. Quit being selfish. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jew, a Hellenistic Jew, whether a Greek, that's a pagan, or the church of God, or maybe the assemblies of God. I don't know. Mistranslation. Just kidding. Verse 33, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. You see, there's eternal consequence in all of this. In situations that are doubtful, that are context determined, the trade-off point is simply this: my advantage versus your advantage. And whenever those two things come in conflict, even if it's only in the context of that moment, when they come in conflict, Paul is teaching the Corinthians his definition of Christian normal, and it's this: I put the seeking of my own advantage aside in favor of you profiting. I trade off my good for your good. And in that way, you benefit and God gets the glory. And that's why we're here anyway. Now, why is this crucially important? Because of that. And I'm going to be really quick on this, because many of the dinners that were taking place here that Paul is talking about, the venues were, yes, private homes of the elite, but they were also taking place in idols' temples. And it's where the social elite gathered. It's where they went to do what we call today, and that is networking. And to be part of that did two things. If you could be part of that crowd, it demonstrated your loyalty to the empire by participating in the feast in idols' temples. Boy, you're getting close to trading off something that you don't want to. And it plugged you into the wealthy and the powerful, the movers and the shakers, for your own personal advantage. You were willing to compromise your own conscience so that you could get to the top of the ladder quicker by knowing all the right people. And so what he's saying is there's a trade-off here, and it's more than just a trade-off about what I eat. He is saying the danger of you being pulled away from the faith is the very real danger that I'm talking about. It's not that you're just going to run out the door and start worshiping an idol. It's not pagan idols that are in the temples all around the city. Yes, they're inspired by demons, absolutely. But you're not going to fall for that. They're nothing at all. It's just a piece of carved stone that other people are bowing down to. It's the connection between the piece of stone and social climbing, he's saying. Now I just hit a whole nother bunch of you. Personal, financial, professional advantage. Because that's what would be the result of participating in these dinners. They're where you went to see and to be seen. Briefly, a speech scholar that I'm familiar with, he's also a Christian professor. Once he went to a neo-pagan rally. He didn't take anyone with him like his friend Bob, who was only saved for 3 seconds. But he went, he felt safe, he felt it was okay. And then while he's there, he's engaging with the people there. He's trying to figure out what this is all about. And he finds out that there is going to be a neo-pagan speaker that's speaking there. And so as a speech scholar, he says, well, I got to hear this. And she gets up there, and please understand, this is coming from the mouth of a neo-pagan individual. This is what she said. Large speakers all around. One guy with a backpack on the grass, listening to her. Other than the best celebrations of the flesh parties that are associated with neo-paganism, what else is there to offer? Well, let me tell you. We're going to change the world with all of this wizardry and all of this technology. We're going to bring that all together. And the young guy's like, yeah! One guy. And she's saying all this stuff, and he begins to think, you know, without that first part of it, without all of those fringe benefits, it loses its luster. That's the thing that draws them in, and that's exactly what was drawing believers and non-believers in to these dinner parties. Yeah, you could climb socially, but to do that, you had to participate in everything they were participating in. And you know what happened after dinner? the traveling brothels came on full force and led you farther and farther away. This is what's happening in Corinth. And when he's talking about food, so what's the connection? When he's talking about food, okay, in surrendering these small things, like food or drink, you're ultimately at risk for surrendering to a whole other agenda, which is to switch from bowing the knee to Christ and serving other people to standing and grasping everything that you can get. And if anything is going to pull you away from faith, it wasn't going to be a piece of carved stone. There's no life in that. It's not going to be the meat. It's going to be this. It's going to be that. And Christian Normal just says, to defend myself with God's help, to grow and to thrive, all I have to say is I'm going to prefer you to me. I will lay down anything I need to so that you can do better, so that you can grow, so that you can fly. And I trust that you'll do the same for me. That you won't let me be exposed to things that might harm me spiritually, or shock me, or set me back. Even if the thing per se is not an issue, but in the context what looks like something so innocent could be actually dead for me, for anybody. The trade-offs don't necessarily get easier. The higher you rise, most of the time they get harder. I'll lay down my life for you. You lay down your life for me. How can you be any more Jesus normal than that? That's the deal. That's the gospel. And you're bickering about meat and what we should do. Go and buy it. Eat it at home. But if somebody else is involved, you better not. Because that's a little thing that leads to a bigger thing. That leads to a bigger thing. That will ultimately lead you and anybody whose eyes are on you away from the faith. This has grave consequences. I will not seek my own advantage, Paul would say. Just look out for the advantage of other people. The truth is, if you do that, you will end up with all of the advantage that you will ever need. If you look out for other people, God will see to it that you have every advantage that you need. So stop the social climbing, stop the bowing of the knee to all of this other junk, and live your life laying it down for other people for the advantage of someone else, even if it means you can't exercise your full freedom. Stand with me if you would. Whew. Now, that was all over the place. My goodness. I think I just want to pray right now. And as the music is playing in the background, and as I'm praying, I just want you to begin to, in these last couple of minutes, I just want you to search your heart. Search your heart about something maybe that was said today. It probably doesn't have to do with what you eat or what you don't eat. But it may have to do with something else that maybe God is dealing with you about right now. So let's just pray. Lord, thank you for the grace, the kind of grace and love that makes it possible to live a life that is a contribution to things and not just a defense against the world. Lord, as we pray right now, as we lift up your name, Lord, we just take these few minutes to offer back to you things that we might need to lay down this morning. So if there's anything in our hearts that we've just discussed this morning, as we take this couple of minutes here, that we just feel like, man, that behavior and that incident and that thing that I've been involved in, just been looking out for me. Even if it's not necessarily wrong, I haven't been thinking about the implications for other people. I've been thinking about me. Lord, so as we pray and think about those things. Holy Spirit, point those out. And help them to be left here, our backpacks to be unpacked of those things with a commitment. As God would give us the grace to be seekers of the advantage of others. That we stop trying to change lanes and begin managing the trade-offs that don't benefit us, but that benefit others. Jesus, you said it this way, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but to lose his soul? No trade-offs, no changing lanes. Lord, for our sake, to just change Jesus' words in this instance, what does it profit a man from causing someone else to lose their soul? That may be Christian, that may be Corinthian normal, it may be American normal, but it certainly isn't Jesus normal. It's toxic, and it needs to be unpacked. Lord, help us to make that trade-off today in our hearts. And then, God, I pray that you give us the grace to live that out. That our own knowledge doesn't puff us up, but that love compels us to deny ourselves for the sake of someone else. And as we said last week, just let the chips fall where they may, because every advantage that I have is in you anyway. And it's for your glory that I pray these things into the lives of the people here today as they invite you to come into their life and pull that toxic stuff out. That would puff itself up and harm someone else, because in doing so, that's an affront to you. And we do things that glorify you. That's our desire. That's our prayer today. Clean us out, Lord, of all of those toxins, and help us to give back into our culture, Christian normal. In Jesus' name, amen.